The AI is using Mechanical Turks, ironically, to get around the robot checks, right? If it can't do it, it can hire humans to do it. How is AI actually engaging as the lead in some of these attacks and simulating and trying to be like humans in attack? At what point are they taking over identities? How are they able to recognize, let's say, decoy credentials or applications more effectively than a human could when they encounter them in an environment? I actually blogged recently on something I call negative trust rather than zero trust, which is how do we make the environment hostile to attackers when they come in?
You are listening to The Secure Developer, where we speak to leaders and experts about DevSecOps, Dev and Sec collaboration, cloud security, and much more. The podcast is part of the DevSecCon community, found on devseccon.com, where you can find incredible dev and security resources and discuss them with other smart and kind community members. This podcast is sponsored by Snyk. Snyk's developer security platform helps developers build secure applications without slowing down, fixing vulnerabilities in code, open source containers, and infrastructure as code. To learn more, visit snyk.io/TSD.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to The Secure Developer. Thanks for tuning back in. Today, we're going to talk about all sorts of interesting things, but maybe specifically focus on AI security and some sort of experienced operator views on it. And for that, we have Sam Curry, who is currently the VP and Chief Information Security Officer at Zscaler, but has a really impressive list of sort of CISO and CTO roles over his history. Sam, thanks for joining us here.
Guy, thanks for having me. It's exciting. Man, this is cool.
I started sort of looking through the resume, and I knew of some, I didn't know of others, but you were CISOs or security leader anywhere from CA to RSA, Arbor, got, I think, Micro Focus in there.
McAfee.
McAfee in it.
We've got MicroStrategy you might have been thinking of. Yeah.
And then, of course, Zscaler now. Maybe, you don't need to sort of, give us the full resume over here, but, can you give us like a quick highlight of how do you think of your journey and maybe a little bit of just context of that feels your time today?
My resume is a mess. I think I told you that earlier, but the reason for it is that I think I'm fundamentally curious about stuff. And I think that's really important. My formal, education and training has been in a few areas. The first is physics and linguistics, strangely enough. I speak a few languages. Also literature and philosophy, and then strangely in counterterrorism. So my master's is in counterterrorism. These were areas that interested me at different times, so I just dove into them. I'm also a fellow at the National Security Institute, but I think I have a habit of not saying no, Guy. That's the problem. People always said, hey, Sam, you got to learn how to say no. And I'm like, actually, no, you don't. I mean, yes, it's important to say what you're not going to do. And I do that from a professional perspective and, managing portfolios and things. But if you want to do something, you will find a way to do it. And if you're fundamentally curious, you can be deep in many areas. So AI, I think we've abused as a term, but it is actually a bucket of many, many different deep technologies, some of which have been around for hundreds of years. And I think we throw it around from a marketing perspective. So I've been thinking about and using a practitioner around AI for a long time, especially the interface with security and privacy. And so when the latest wave hit us, it wasn't a big surprise, even if the applications were surprising. I'm certainly excited about where it's going, and I'm a little bit skeptical of some of the fear mongering going on, that it is belying some rather nasty intent. But I'm actually super excited about some of the things you're doing, Guy, and I'm looking forward to this chat. So I don't know if you want me to unpack anything in my background. I'm sure people can look at LinkedIn, but most of it, I think, applies quite readily here.
Yeah, no, I think it's again, long and impressive. And I think maybe one thing I would note is above and beyond sort of the security leadership roles, you do have quite a bit of sort of education background, and you're an adjunct.
I still teach. I really want to pay it forward. So I teach, especially undergrad and grad in cyber and some adjacent areas. Yeah.
That's great. Maybe we just sort of jump a bit into the AI security path. And, you mentioned you're skeptical. I thought your continuation there was that you're skeptical of the capabilities on it. But before maybe we go into AI security, how do you feel about AI technology? Like, are you sort of seen it evolve, but were you kind of surprised, amazed, maybe not so much?
Delighted, actually. I think I was delighted is the word I would use.
Delighted.
Now that's the first reaction, because there's a lot to unpack there. We tend to mix how we think and how we feel, and it's very difficult to unpack it. The first thing I'm going to say, it is going to be disruptive in ways that we don't entirely expect. And many years ago, I forget who said it, it might have been Tim Berners-Lee, about the internet is both, but simultaneously the most overrated and underrated technology we've ever had. And I think this is even more so. Maybe this is supplanting that. But I had a series of conversations recently with Daniel Miessler, most recently, about how it's really about augmented humans and that the human experience is fundamentally interesting to me. And while I know it's going to be very difficult for us societally in some places to deal with the introduction of AI, just as it was with automobiles, just as it was with the internet, I'm also super excited about what it means for what we can do and what the human condition can be like as we learn to apply this. I'm interested for how it will empower everyone to be a developer and for artistic creation and innovation and where we can take that. That's really an amazing thing. The fear of AI, though, has been grossly exaggerated by people with very, very little to no evidence to back it up. And very often special interest groups are in particular very, very protective around that. And they're amplifying that voice. That really disturbs me, especially because it's backed with very little science or evidence. But so my initial reaction was delight. Yeah. When I first interacted with it and saw what it could do at scale. I mean, forget the ones that were rushed out too quickly. Certainly the sort of chat GPTs, when they hit the market, they hit it amazingly. But learning how to use it correctly and how to interact with it is non-trivial. And I never thought my linguistics would collide so completely with my cyber so fast. And with my own background in the AI toolkit, all of it came together and I went, okay, wow, this all makes sense to me. Yeah. Because there were so many different domains in AI that were mutually exclusive in the research. If you go look at the research, they were in different areas. The advances were mutually exclusive. And what you're finding now is if you look at the real academic research, it's all mutually reinforcing now. So the rate of advancement in AI is actually accelerating, and the applicability of it in more domains is becoming much more interesting and accelerating, which is really cool.
I love the word delight for it. I haven't sort of used it for it.
I only just thought of it just then because it was a reaction.
Yeah.
But yeah,
it's a good one because, I feel when I kind of talk to my kids or something and talk about this, I really feel like a bunch of these tools give you an opportunity to feel like a kid and believe in magic again. You interact. It is different. And with all the fallacies, and we're going to talk a lot about them, and the areas where there are pitfalls, but fundamentally the sensation of it is indeed one of delight, generating an image in Midjourney or, having, some juggling that ChatGPT manages to get to kind of go through when you ask it to, just sort of feels fun.
And magic is a great word, by the way. What we want a world that responds to us magically. Your children, my children, are going to grow up in a world that magically understands them better. And we almost can't understand to the degree to which that's going to be true. The line will blur between what is a digital world and what is a physical world. And the flip side of that is the word hallucination. And it's true for AIs, it's true for humans too. How do we keep them grounded in what is real? Which was a philosophical question, also part of my academic background. And it was a very distinct question. We were like, yeah, what do we really mean by what's real and the epistemological side of that? But it's going to have a real meaning soon. What is really real? And when am I hallucinating? When is the AI hallucinating? And when is it magical? Is a different question. Magical as opposed to magic, right?
Yeah. I guess, at the risk of kind of belaboring this analogy a little bit, the magic and the history with magic also includes, of course, the witchcraft and sort of the evil magic aspect and sort of countless tales of magic that was spun out of control.
The Gollum story, for instance.
To some extent, I didn't think it might sort of stretch that far. We're going to get into the sort of the critique in a sec, but just want to kind of get a bit of a picture. Have you managed to, do you find yourself using any of these tools beyond just like exploration or fun, ChatGPT or any of these other, do you use them in your day-to-day?
I don't. My brother does. So my brother's also in cyber. So for instance, I write very quickly and I express myself almost transparently as a writer. I speak and I write. I think the styles are maybe a little bit different. So for instance, I tried, but the writing didn't come out as well. My brother, and I don't think he would mind me saying this, he's very verbally proficient, but he's never been a good writer. And he's found ways to make ChatGPT spin and to represent him in writing as an extension of himself much, much better than he can write. And so in about the same period of time, for me, it takes 20, 30 minutes to write 1,000, 500, 1,000 words, and it comes out. You can read my blogs. My brother now takes about the same period of time. He spends most of his time massaging the inputs and the prompts and the edits, whereas I spend most of my time direct input. And then I maybe get someone to edit it for me for quick typos and things, because that's painful to do to yourself. I do it for other people though.
Yeah.
Now, I'm reminded of a conversation with Gary Kasparov back in 2018. He was speaking at a show and buttonhole him after. And he was talking about, Deep Blue and about what it was like to be beaten by the chess machine. And he actually, the conclusion of his talk was, for about a 10-year period, the best chess was played by assisted humans. And so that's where the excitement comes in. What's it going to be like to live in a world where people who've had a barrier of how they communicate in writing or in art or in any form of expression where they haven't built the ability to do that now have an AI or LLM or whatever tool you want to call
some
it,
sort of
or
AI,
coding.
like it is, AI is the right term in that context, which is
Right, or
regardless of what
coding
is
or
the underpinning of
scripting.
it.
Yeah,
So,
QA, those sorts of things. Somebody who can now have the tool made transparent, where you focus on the task rather than on the tool. And now the question is if you can identify what's good, which is something I tell my students. I've said, I expect you to use these tools because they're part of the workforce. Now I'm going to judge you on how you use them and the fact that you cite them. So that's an interesting world because so many more people can enter into the more advanced things. The productivity can actually go way up.
I absolutely agree with that. And it's interesting there's a whole, we're not going to open that brand, but there's a whole area of what should schools educate on with regards to those AIs. Universities are one flavor of that, in earlier stages, even more so.
Yep.
AI is amazing, and so we could probably ramble on here for a while on that, on the sort of the great potential advancements that we can have of a future world. Let's sort of shift gears, from a security perspective. So, AI security also a concern, one that many security leaders, company leaders, frankly individuals, they're sort of facing very quickly for the first time, right? Companies quick to commit large percentages of their companies to really kind of invest in AI, and many people are kind of caught unprepared for something like that and say, well, what is it that I even need to think about for AI security? So maybe let's start high level. When you're, say, theoretically, although very practically, you're a security leader of an organization, with some significant business, and you are now tackled to say you should do something about AI security. How do you start? How do you break it down?
Yeah, it's funny because Zscaler, of course, is in authorization, and we talk about zero trust. So we're right in the authorization pathway of should somebody do something or not, right? So we get this one a lot. The first thing that people worry about, and it reminds me of, I'll just say three other things that came to mind as you were talking. I was like, the first one was, should companies allow the use of browsers and specifically search engines? This came up. The second one was, should they allow the use of instant messaging? And this came up most immediately with respect to trading. If you remember, brokers started to use trading because it was instantly able to communicate, and they could get, we would call it insider information, but they were able to get data sooner. The same thing happened later with SaaS applications. Should people be able to interact with these unknown entities that have services? And now it's coming up with AI and with large language models and the interfaces. And so, like, what happens if people start asking for briefs and if they start entering data and asking for summaries? And you can look at this at scale. Right. So what does it do for privacy? What does it do for IP? What does it do for intellectual property that isn't yours, that you have on behalf of a customer? And so the questions come up immediately. Now, who owns them? How are they tapped? Which other, learning sets do they go into? Is it private? And of course, almost none of that is answerable. And when you look around, most of them were built on dodgy inputs from a copyright perspective to begin with. So this fight's going on over, were these trained on public domain things or on private IP to begin with? And then the question is exactly where it went with some of these SaaS models. What's the APIs into those? Who's tapping into that? Who's instrumenting that? Who's saying, well, how many people ask questions about, gold and mining in the last 24 hours of all these LLMs? And is that changing? I picked that one at random, right? But that could be useful insight and trending for somebody who's trading on a commodities exchange. I just picked one. There's so many. So the first thing people are saying is don't allow it. Like, just stop it. But that doesn't work, because if you just stop it, people will find a way to do it anyway, just as they do with instant messaging. They go to their phone or they go to another machine, especially in a work from home or hybrid environment, or people start to disguise these services as other things. They change the shape of it. They change the input. It's now it doesn't look like an LLM interface. And then you get dodgy offerings where people actually are like, wait a minute, I can actually not only offer this, I could offer it as a rogue service and sell the information on the back end. And so the next thing people do is, okay, how do I vet
So
the
before you go
correct
to
ones?
the next thing on it, so you're saying that sort of the first concern, if I go back, the first thought that comes to mind for security leader is, well, can I stop this?
Well,
Can
yeah,
I
if
say
the business
no?
says, hey,
And
security
you're
leader,
saying the answer is no. You
yeah.
cannot. This is an opportunity. You can kind of waste some cycles trying to put some
But you can
fence
actually stop
and
it.
prevent it. But people will find a way to use it anyway. And the demand, the appeal is too high for the security leader to say, thou shalt not pass for anything but like a very brief period of time.
Right. I mean, usually it's actually the business is saying, security leader or IT leader, stop it. And it's sort of like putting sandbags up for a flood. It'll work a little bit. And as the flood continues, it starts to leak. Right. And then the next phase is they say, okay, we're going to allow some, we're going to try and vet these. And the next phase after that is we're going to build our own, because a lot of it's open source and there's these companies exist. They're going to make a private instance of it. And then at that point is when we start to say, okay, so now what can tap into it? And that's when you get into the more mature phase of sort of figuring out how to use it for the business. And the faster you get there, by the way, it's not easy. You can't just jump to it. You have to think about it. You've actually got to process what it means to the business. If you just jump to it, you're going to make a bunch of mistakes, but you can accelerate it by starting the strategy talks now. And when you actually start to integrate it to the business and say, okay, what does this mean for how we operate and processes and, what jobs look like? It is disruptive, but it is going to be a force multiplier for a lot of productivity. It's going to be scary for many people, but it is going to open up new jobs. It's going to open up new ways of doing work. And it's one of those things, you couldn't hold the mini computer back from the business. You can hold the mainframe back from the business. You're not going to hold this one back.
And it's interesting. You're tying, like when you talk about using your own, so, step one, put the sandbags, try to sort of stop the flood. It might buy you a moment, but just sort of know that's not going to last long. And then after that, some form of controlled usage, which is also, I guess, it stems the flood a little bit. That's maybe the drain, but you allow some of it. But then from there, you're saying that the next evolution is really to build your own versus to really lean in and embrace. You feel,
or you could do both. You might say, hey, this vendor, we've vetted them, we're working with them, they've passed our privacy controls, you trust them. Now that's a big step. It would require, but we did it with IaaS and PaaS, right? Mm-hmm. We trust AWS, we trust Azure, we trust GCP, we trust OCI. I think those things have happened, but we didn't originally. Now that can happen here too. These will become platforms like them at some point. Whether it'll be these vendors or not remains to be seen, because that'll play out. But the other possibility is, just like in the cloud, we have private cloud, right?
Yeah,
we will
that's a
also
really
have
interesting analogy. Yeah,
private AI. Yeah. And so it's happening, by the way. Companies are saying, oh, we're building our own, so we'll be able to do our own internal search through our knowledge bases. Don't worry, it'll be great. But the fact remains, just like with the cloud, which was, of course, other people's computers, is how we denigrated it in the old days, right? But with AI, the larger models and the more training and the more experience really will be more adept at, let's just call it, seeming to think.
The advantage of the professional at scale, the scale economies themselves, that AI kind of can tap into are even stronger. Those played a key role in cloud, which I guess I wouldn't say the private cloud is dead.
It's not.
Alive,
no.
But I think it has diminished. It started, you're right, as to a large degree is through the fear factor, through the lack of trust. I want to use cloud, but I can't because it's not trustworthy enough. I'm going to run my own. I think that specific use case has diminished a fair bit as we built that. So
but it's a good intermediate step, and it may develop, longevity of its own. One of the things that I think will come about is how to keep it fresh and private, right? How will you keep it in sync, up to date, relevant, as intelligent as the other AIs? Think of these AIs as going through school, right? They're going up through various grade levels, and the public ones are going to be going up through grade levels much more quickly.
And I think, so in all of these cases, Sam, you've kind of taken it down a path, which I understand, and I think is almost infrastructural and data. So you're saying the starting concern you have is there's this data that I have, whether it's, my employees who typed in something and that data is mined, or whether it is, the data access that I got and the authorization to who can access what, even on the internet. And then from there, you kind of get it down into infrastructure. Okay, so how much do I allow? How much do I contain that data? And do I even let the data leave my premise, or do I?
It's more than the data. It's also the metadata about how you're interacting with it, what you're asking of it. But yes, you're right.
Yeah. So
that's the first concern. Yeah.
That's the first concern. It makes sense. AI, like artificial intelligence, machine learning, has data very much at its core. So there's something very sensible about that being the first concern on it. I guess if we take it down to sort of the systems level, then, what's the next concern? So you're worried about data, or what, before we go to systems, let's dig into the part in which you build your own and you use your own data. So this isn't about data leaking because someone typed it into ChatGPT, but rather you want to leverage this technology, whether you're building your LLM or using OpenAI or whomever. I guess, how do you think about the security concerns there? And maybe should that be taboo? You're in the authorization world, at the moment. Is it sort of safe enough for that? Or
so in the taxonomy, we've sort of started at the highest level. I think of a taxonomy in nature. We start at the highest level with AI for the business, right? And then the security and privacy concerns around that. At another level, there's also AI for security, right? And there's another one that's security of AI. And so those are three big buckets. In the AI for security, if we break it further down, we've got how it helps humans do the security job, the assisted human, right? And this is how does it help you find signal from noise in the blue team? How does it help you do guided response? How does it help you in the red team, right? To build the better tools for attack. And super cool example is I was at a conference recently at Duke University that was talking to regulators, in particular from the developing world. And somebody suggested you should not allow offensive use of AI. And I said, all due respect, no. You need to find the ethical way to do it, because the opponents are using this. Most of it's open source, how it's done. It's not, that's out. And if you hamstring pen testers in red team, then the blue team never builds the calluses and the ability to resist the adaptive red team that's using these tools. It can help you in defense as well in blue teaming. It can help you with scripts. I'd love to get to a world where the defenders, and I think this is particularly relevant for Snyk, where the defenders become iterative developers very quickly, where they build little devlets, right? Little applets. And most of the blue team environment is a development environment, and they're iterating questions very quickly, assisted by and maybe accelerated by AI. There's also this notion of yellow teaming, which isn't very spoken of very often. That is not security for DevOps, but DevOps for security. How do you build better tools for the blue team and the red team? And they can have their sprints accelerated as well. And then there's the AI actually on offense, not just helping the attackers, but the AI engaged. So you may have heard the AI is using Mechanical Turks, ironically, to get around the robot checks, right? If it can't do it, it can hire humans to do it. Mm-hmm. How is AI actually engaging as the lead in some of these attacks and simulating and trying to be like humans in attack? At what point are they taking over identities? How are they able to recognize, let's say, decoy credentials or applications more effectively than a human could when they encounter them in an environment? I actually blogged recently on something I call negative trust rather than zero trust, which is how do we make the environment hostile to attackers when they come in? And so that's just the second bucket. And then there's the security of the AI itself.
So AI for security is a fascinating space. So, and I guess, again, just sort of echoing back, you're pointing out two things, right? One is the arms race. It's the attackers are going to use it. So you better, you either use it or you fall behind, and you'll lose the battle, you lose the war. So that's the kind of the meta. Well, and then second is you were saying also on a practical level, and you give a whole bunch of examples. Why wouldn't you? AI can do all these other things, all these problems. And I like the evolution. So you're kind of describing at the beginning, it can do the grunt work for you. At some point, you might be doing the grunt work for it, but eventually the end system should be one that is more secure, and it can aspire to a maybe negative security and hostile environment. The UK hostile environment is something totally different at the moment in immigration. So tricky term to use, but in like a very self-defending, adaptable defending environment that tries to identify an attacker that is in the network and seal them off. Those are things that are basically impossible to do at human speed. So it requires AI. So kind of believe me.
There's one of the bucket though, Guy, which is highly relevant to Snyk. I think it's the doing the triage in AppSec. It's the predicting. It's not just what's the most important thing to address, based on the sort of measure countermeasure world that will come in active conflict, but where are you likely to have vulnerabilities? So there's the known vulnerabilities, and there's a prediction of where you're going to have vulnerabilities, and therefore where you should be focusing things like virtual patching. You're likely to have a buffer overflow here, or you're likely to have vulnerability to high-bit shellcode or something, or SQL injection, et cetera. But that all exists in that same bucket, right? So you can, and the attackers will likely be predicting similarly, oh, there's probably going to be a vulnerability there that'll accelerate their research cycles. So that's one step removed from the war fighting, if you will, right? How do you prepare in the InfoSec cycles to be efficient to reduce the attack surface, and how do they predict likewise where the attack surface is going to exist now? They call it the 0-day predictor.
Yeah, I think very relevant, and there's like, I don't know, 15 different AI strands going on at Snyk, many of them, by the way, far before the current trend. But indeed, for instance, when we talk about, you're talking about sort of the risk areas, but also there's a lot around automatically bolstering the code, or sort of, strengthening, hardening the code. It starts from the more straight vulnerability fixes. And we have this auto fix at the moment. Now, the moment auto fix is like a spell checker that shows you the squiggly line, and you right click and you fix it. And so it's sort of a little bit more human action. It sort of makes it easier. But when you think about the destination of auto fix, is like, why wouldn't it automatically correct, as you go through? And that freaks some people out. But over time, feels like it's an obvious destination. And over time, says, well, if you can do that, why wouldn't you just glance at a system, find those issues, and just fix them, and just kind of make it happen on the go? And from there on, you can go to things, and you can take away, just like you talk about with the risk, you can go from systems that are vulnerable to systems that are just not sufficiently robust. So can you add defense in depth and add that automatically on top of the code? And it's just not feasible to do in a non-AI manner, because the automation is what takes you to the next level.
We never thought about this because it's such a waste, right? Because it's so expensive from a dev perspective. But right now, we think of deception as something that's done in an IT context. It could be done in a DevOps context. It could be done in code. So, for instance, we're busy closing vulnerabilities, and we've got tech debt and security debt. But it's entirely possible at some point we could say, you know what? We would normally have a vulnerability here of type X, right? Why don't we put a decoy there that looks like there's a vulnerability, so that I can have a little signal that I could send to an incident response team if this app is attacked in the obvious place? Because the reason we don't right now is there's just not enough resources to do that. But what if it was trivially inexpensive, and we could code those in de facto as we were going for very little expense? It doesn't expose a real vulnerability. It's just, it looks like a kick me sign, but actually it sends a signal. That's the kind of negative trust I'd like to get in the application layer. But I don't think that's imminent. I think that's probably a ways down the road when we get much more efficient in our DevOps cycles. But yeah, for sure. To be frank, we stayed in fairly positive land here, right? Like AI positive land. There's also security for AI, but
AI for security positive land, of like how AI could really help us, not just with functionality, but actually would be more secure, with a slight warning sign that if we don't, the attackers will. Let's indeed kind of open up the Pandora box, sort of the dark side, and talk about security for AI. So maybe let me start with a bit more of a meta question. Like, what scares you the most? What security concern around the use of AI or LLMs you find most scary?
Okay. Yeah. So there's two concerns. I'll go from the biggest to the second biggest. The biggest that I have is, so far, for the last 20 years, the attackers have been evolving their capabilities. They've been advancing and adapting faster than defenders. What do I mean by that? Well, the market for doing bad things is growing faster than the security market. Now, there's a healthy, active, robust, dark market out there. The ability to pop a company is getting shorter. The availability of toolkits that blast through most people's security is becoming more readily available at a faster rate. Compare that to the security debt most companies have, the rate at which it's burned down. Now, why is it that way? Well, attackers at nation state levels and financially motivated ones, 100% of their energy is focused on busting in. In defense, we have to worry about convincing a CFO if we need a tool. We don't get to put all of our resources on defense. We are a fraction of the IT budget in terms of people and in terms of spend. So, if you think your typical company spends 12% on R&D, Right now, I realize smaller companies is higher, bigger companies could be a little bit less. Let's imagine the bad guys are a typical company. That means 12% of their budget goes to R&D. That's not the number that goes to security in a typical company. It's a fraction of that. It's like maybe 1% in a really leaning forward company. So compare those numbers. It's frightening. So my number one fear is that AI will accelerate them, hyper accelerate them. Their curve will go higher, faster than the impact in defense. So that's my number one fear. And what's the fear of that really? It's a business fear. It's that we love to embrace technology because of what it means for us societally and what it means for the economy. And this is one of the big engines for human society right now. And all the wonderful things we want to come from IT. But the risk curve is catching up behind it because of these threats. My fear is that it will cross over and become a real inhibitor to new investment and new business. That's number one.
The thing to do about it beyond the meta is to invest in the use of AI for defense, fundamentally.
Oh, yeah. And to rethink in defense how we apply ourselves. The biggest problem in security is the gap between the security department and the business. We have to make advances in alignment. We don't just have to spend more. We have to adapt faster. We have to get more relevant. One of the great things that regulations and auditing did is it forced companies to pay attention to security. One of the terrible things it's doing is it's locking us into how we spend our money for decades. Most of our spend is check boxes over stuff we've been doing for 20 years. It's great that it made us do it. Now we're stuck doing it. Like most of the spend as a CISO is on things like antivirus and firewalls and VPNs. Most of that stuff hasn't changed in 20 years. So how do you free money up to place new bets, to try new things, right? So we've got to get more agile and flexible in security operations and toolkit and stack.
Yeah, it's a really kind of important point on regulation. So you're not objecting to regulation existing.
No.
In fact, you're sort of encouraging it to force someone to invest. But you're saying once invested in the zero-sum game that is my security budget, it is forcing me to spend money in areas that I do not want.
Yeah, I call it discretionary versus statutory spend. Your discretionary spend should be about reducing risk, whereas your statutory spend is about avoiding fines.
Yeah.
How do you convince the regulators that you're moving out of the check boxes because the risk behind those things is resolved? And now you're moving the funds to where it's useful to reduce risks in an emerging, changing, adaptive world where the opponent is a human being innovating and doing R&D. Now, the second risk has to do with the human side. We talked about a talent gap and not enough people. So one of the great things that LLMs will do in AI is it will rapidly increase the rate at which people can learn and enter the industry. But engineering has this horrible thing called leaky abstraction, which is whenever you build something, you create an abstraction layer that hides complexity behind it. And if you just deal with the abstraction layer and don't truly understand what's underneath, you begin to make mistakes. So for instance, if the LLM starts to tell you, hey, you're being attacked by this attacker, and it fits here in the MITRE attack framework, and here's the next step, and here's the recommended next step or counter from the MITRE engage framework, it becomes a rote ability without much intelligence. And so the operator doesn't know, where is this coming from under the hood? Now, that's an opportunity for two kinds of mistakes. I used to call this the mirror chess problem with automation. The first is you become predictable. And in mirror chess, if you've ever played chess and you mirror your opponent, sorry, I love chess. I mentioned Gary earlier, right? But if you mirror your opponent, you can be defeated because they know what you're going to do in response to them. It's an asymmetric game, believe it or not, chess, right? Because there's a reason for it, but in time, it's asymmetric and on the board, actually. And so that's the first problem. They know what you're going to do when you do something. That's a weakness. The second thing is you can be subject to poisoning, meaning somebody will know how your LLM is learning or how your AI is learning. And as a result, they already do this with virus samples, right? Over 30% of virus samples are planted to create false noise. They will start to poison the feedback loops such that their signal will get through, and they will test against it. They'll get the exact same LLMs and the exact same AIs and say, let's run attacks until they don't find us. So I'm worried about that leaky abstraction, that ocean of talent that will come out and will no longer be able to find the deep subs that are going through.
Yeah. And I guess that's part skill and part blind trust, right? Because you're like, if for you to be able to benefit from an AI powered system, there has to be an element of trust. If you go off and you verify
Exactly.
everything, then you would lose the very efficiency that you sought out to get with the AI in the first
Yeah.
place. We see there's a bunch of these studies from Stanford and the likes, and they show how code completion suffers from this type of element. On one hand, more people can generate code, and notably developers can become 10 times more efficient because they can generate code. And that's amazing. No, it truly is, no but to it. What's happening in parallel is that code that gets generated gets more likely reviewed. If you need to invest in it the same amount of effort that you would have had to if you had written it, you'd lose the productivity benefit. So almost by design, you do not scrutinize it that much.
Yeah.
The code, shall we say, is equal in the number of vulnerabilities. It depends on, of course, the individual developer that you compare it to, but it definitely frequently has. I think it's like 40% of the written code has vulnerabilities. That's probably like a similar number to human written code. Most code does have vulnerabilities in it, but I think the difference is that it doesn't get scrutinized. It doesn't get properly reviewed because it's being trusted. You can't not trust it or you'll lose it. You have to trust it to a degree, but if you trust it too much, then you become...
So you change how the sausage is made. The question is then, do you get more sausage, or does it taste better at the end?
Yeah, you do end up getting... You'll notice if you got a burger, but...
That's right. That's right.
But you don't really know what's inside. On the human side, so we have one concern is really one of investment. So that sounds a very practical thing. We need to invest in AI.
And quality of investment, yeah.
And the quality of investment specifically on AI defense. And it was a very good point. I love this definition of the statutory versus discretionary spend. And then, the second one is on skills or loss of those skills. Side note,
the deep skills that come over time. Yeah.
This conversation happens also in art, as you talk about. Fine, everybody can be able to prevent art, but the masters will continue to be valuable. But lo and behold, to become a master, you need to be a junior at some point. You need to work through those.
I forget who it was. Picasso said, somebody's going to get mad. It took me 4 years to paint like a master and a lifetime to paint like a child.
Yeah.
So
there's evolutions, but you have to go through a journey to.
That's right.
Maybe if you're Picasso in 4 years, you can get to that. How do you feel about, as we talk about trust and we talk about skills, there's also the human threat element. How do you think about that? How do you think about, one of the top concerns that come to mind when people talk about AI and notably LLM is sort of social manipulation, social engineering attacks at scale, whether it's on the phishing front or the supply chain front or a variety of others.
It's huge. The spear phishing becoming almost like a sniper rifle, right? It's very real. It's precisely because it can iterate and it can test and it can get very, very good. Look at most phishing attacks right now. The way that we spot it, if you do the awareness training, you're looking for the stupid errors made by the people who built it. All right. Did they get the logo right? Was their grammar off? Does the link look weird? That stuff's solvable at scale and reliably. And so a friend of mine, Ite Mayor, and I, we did a webinar back in February where he asked ChatGPT to write a phishing email from the voice of, if you've seen Succession, Logan Roy, the CEO. He said, write it, and he wanted it to cite, I forget who the poet was, but he wanted it to have a quote from this poet, and it was a phishing email, and it was perfect. It was his voice. It cited the poet. It was Robert Frost, actually. And he came out with obviously the path less traveled, but then he said, find a better poem that's more subtle, and it did. And it was frightening how believable it was. And you could in your head imagine somebody from this company, if you've seen Succession, how much it was in his voice. And you could imagine somebody actually going, yeah, this is from him, click.
Yeah.
And when it had been on the market in this version for a few months, and you could see how if a bad actor had a version and trained it and then kept improving it and refining it, tuning it, just how effective it would be. That is a very real threat. Now you combine that with things like deep fakes and other technologies and voices. So that it really sounds like the voice of your boss calling. It's really their personality, using words they use, responding to you as they have. And it happens to have followed your social media network. So it knows when you were with them and can cite those instances, you're in trouble.
Yeah. So what do you do? I share the concern. I did a little workshop in my kids' school, sort of secondary school. And within 10 minutes, we generated a video of Taylor Swift,
Oh, wow.
saying something in her voice, in her style. ChatGPT created text in her style, a sampled voice from a podcast created her audio, and a bunch of other sort of DID and 11 Labs tool created the actual video clips. It was impressive. Good conversation in the school to talk to them about, both show them the power of AI and talk about the negative implications. I think we're generally, I'm seeking good solutions here. Is what do you do about it as a security leader? So the concern is real, the phishing is real. I mean, is this a training solution? I mean, how do you prepare for this on the organization?
Yeah, training is not the solution. Training is part of the solution because you never do without it for two reasons. One, you're regulated on it. And two, it's always smart to have people be more informed. You can try to even gamify things, have them be more active, but you don't want to be a complete pain, right? And so it's got to be practical and usable, right? But the real answer here is we have to stop being terrified of what could be done and deal with what is being done, even when the rate of innovation is very, very high. And what do I mean by that? I've been in cyber, or as we used to call it, InfoSec back in the day, for 30 years, right? The doomsday scenarios have existed. Most have not happened. The vast majority, 99.999. That doesn't mean that'll always be that way. But I used to go to conferences like RSA in the early days, right? Back in the mid 90s and late 90s. Somebody would put their hand up and say, I've come up with an amazing security control. And everyone's like, yes. And then somebody finds one corner case that breaks it. And everyone goes, oh, they're all so depressed. The fact of the matter is most things are in the middle. And we can talk about the hypotheticals of what the bad guys could do. What we have to focus on is what they do. Because there's an economy of scale associated with doing it. It may seem trivial in the proof of concepts. It may seem trivial in the execution. But until they actually do it, you don't have to do much about it. The first cases will break through, fine. But we can't be preparing for every possible application. And that may sound really weird. And someone's out there going, oh, hell no, right? But at the end of the day, you got to deal with what really happens. And there are controls for this. So let's take your scenario. Now, not Taylor Swift, but let's say somebody tries to be your CFO and says, go buy gift cards. Okay, got that. The way to deal with that is that you have very specific ways in the company that money can move, and it never moves in other ways. So even if the real CFO called you and asked for gift cards, you simply can't do it. Like, you put business controls in place to deal with that. The terrifying scenario that gets you in the gut and that could happen right now for low cost, you can actually put a relatively simple business control in place to avoid.
Yeah.
You will do that. A few companies will get hit when someone does it, but you know what? That's the main reason that hasn't got that sophisticated, because relatively simple controls can prevent it. For large companies, certainly. For very, very small companies, Wendy Nather used to refer to something called the security poverty line. Below a certain level of size company and income, and in some verticals, there's simply not even a security person. In many cases, not an IT person. Those companies, it's much more real as a threat.
Right.
Like, let's say you're you're a small restaurant with 3 restaurants in a town, right? I'm actually thinking of one right now. And your accountant calls you and says, hey, the IRS is after you. You've got to pay $15,000 in the next 24 hours or else. You'll do it. But how are you supposed to prevent that? That's much more real than, the Taylor Swift scenario applied to a large bank.
Yeah, I think those are good practices. I think there's a broad application of the suggestion you just made, which is, for the bank, I think it's relatively straightforward, but in practice, you can also do this around applying common sense on who gets access to, don't have passwords, for instance, work with 2-factor authentication in those. And so you can't really give someone access to it. And then I guess explaining and teaching people not so much about the fraudulent email, but rather about the ask, about the oddity of the ask itself.
Well, you've also reminded me, I tell my kids that Taylor Swift will not contact them. So, yeah.
It's someone's recommendation. And while I don't think we're going to use it, we actually defined a safe word in the family. On a thing to use to it, which we've kind of had for
that's
the
a very
anyway. I don't know if anybody will remember it if the situation actually actually takes place, but a good exercise to even just remember to ask it for the oddity. Well,
you have a safe phrase to trigger it as well?
No, it wasn't really. I'm in distress mode. It's more if someone, or if a kid gets an ask from you to meet them at some spot or to send something for them or to do then they know if it seems like an odd request, vet it with.
You have to practice that, right? You got to tabletop it.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah, I need to do. I've not done a red team on the kids yet.
That's awesome.
That's a different. I don't know that I'll get to that anytime soon. And so we're kind of approaching the end of time. I'd love to just sort of try and get, like, we try to kind of unpack here, the high level excitement from AI, the acknowledgement that you can't stop the train. You have to accept that you're doing it. Talked a little bit about the separation of AI for security and its positive opportunities and maybe the necessity because of the AI arms race. Talked a little bit about security for AI and your sort of top 2 or 3 concerns there. If we kind of bring it down just to the world of very practical, right? You're a situation that many CISOs are in today, some groups in their team, I mean, even putting aside the use of AI, because I think you actually gave a good answer to it. More people want to add AI to their apps. They want to add whatever, a chat bot to something that is not public data, call it, in their system, and they want to run it. What's the sort of the primary, what's the kind of the high level or sort of actionable advice that you would give someone in that position to do?
The first thing I would say is have firsthand knowledge of it, like play with it. I can't stress enough how well directed play is a good tool for learning. And your brain is a place where ideas meet and combine. And that happens through when you're reading and listening to a podcast and when you're actually using a tool. So go do that. Personally, go do that. That's number one. Number two, convene a group of people and socialize the ideas. Don't turn up with the answers, right? Number three, start a project, right? And make sure it's business driven, right? It's not just for the sake of doing it. And it's also got security present. So, for instance, most of the companies I've worked at have had multiple places where there are knowledge bases and tools and competitive battle cards and PowerPoints and, brochures and training material. But after 3 or 4 years, try to find something. I mean, really try to find something, especially if you're a new employee. So you're like, oh, now I've got to go see a customer and they've asked about how we stack up against that company.
It's just a little bit funny because like one of the solutions at the moment is to create a chat interface to search that data. But
precisely.
But that says,
but everybody's trying
taken, which is that data gets lost in the system. You might not even know that you need to search for it.
Yeah. And by the way, we had this exact problem with searches. We tried to build Google for Insight or whatever, right? And Alta Vista for Insight, if you go back far enough, right? But a lot of those projects are business driven. If they can produce results internally on the internal data, fantastic. So now go socialize. That's a business driven thing. You can put real metrics and a business case around it, and you can have security present at the table because now you got to ask the question, who can get to it? Under what conditions? How do you authorize it? Where can they get to it from? Etc. What are the APIs that plug into it? It can see everything. Should it? Right? What can it see? So if a bad guy got in and could get an interface and they could say, show me all contracts. Ugh. Yeah. Right. So my advice is first start at the simple level of understanding it, and then go right through to the point of having a project. And then this is a key point. Seek external communities to either advise and validate or to socialize the ideas of what you're doing and see what they're doing. Because you're not the only people going through this. Every company is going through this right now. And governments are going through this right now, by the way. Imagine what it's like to do this for a national government. The risks to things like national security, but also the opportunities are huge.
Yep, that's I guess the truth for most amazing technologies, and this one just sort of landed on us.
And that is the truth. Yeah,
I think that's great advice. Demystify it, get a seat at the table, kind of be part of the conversation, but remember to keep it business oriented, and then kind of collaborate not just with the people inside on the business, but also with the community.
Have fun. Have fun with it. By the way, it is scary, but
I think the demystification and playing with it is such sound advice. For what it's worth, we've been at this point for a bunch of months now, but even just having AI primer conversations with the company, opening people's eyes towards it. It's amazing, especially if you are one that is a bit more in it, to realize how many people do not have it and the level of understanding you get from just a few hours of play with it versus the others. Literally, as we're recording this podcast, there is an AI hackathon happening right now at Sneak, which will be fun. I'm already sort of seeing a bunch of very cool initiatives. But above and beyond whatever comes out of that is just the fact that people are exposed to it, both from an ability and a risk perspective, is priceless. I'll sort of steal the last couple of minutes. I don't know. I'm asking you a question that wouldn't really have a 2-minute answer to it, but I'm going to ask you to take out your crystal ball and say,
Oh,
hey, we're in this sort of world of AI security. Well, we started with magic. We talked about crystal balls are totally in line with that analogy. And say in 5 years' time, eternity in AI world, what do you see as the sort of the state of AI security?
what was it Einstein said? I don't know what the next war will be fought with, but the one after will be with axes and stones. I'm paraphrasing. It's been a long time since we thought this would be a simple problem, right? It was 1960. Someone said, oh, we'll solve this in a couple of years. We still don't have a general intelligence. We still don't have another sentience to speak to. One of the biggest insights that I heard was from Daniel Miessler, who I mentioned earlier. He said, ChatGPT and LLMs have understanding, but they don't have sentience. And I would add that they don't take initiative. They don't have reasoning. Right? So ChatGPT doesn't come and ask you questions, right? That's very important. Now, there's other forms of AI. There's other tools in the AI toolkit that can do things like that, but we haven't broken through a number of very critical barriers to intelligence. This is why a lot of the hype that I hear is really hype. But I think the most important thing we're going to get in the sort of 3 to 5 year time frame, if that's what you're concerned about, is it will become boring and commonplace. We'll hit what Gartner calls the plateau of productivity. We may be faced with two big things. And I say may because the thing about crystal balls is it's easy to predict 100 years out. It's really hard to predict short period, right? But there's two big things that could come along. One is a Luddite-like revolution where people want to break the mills and really put the genie back in the bottle, right? And the other one is further breakthroughs in sentience, in reasoning, or in ability for intelligence to take initiative. One of the things that's fascinating is the degree to which intelligence appears to be emergent in complex systems, and actually not as complex systems as we've always thought. Many more animals appear to be intelligent. Many more forms of life, including, believe it or not, plants and mycology, seem to have emergent intelligence, which is taking the world by storm right now. And even some seemingly natural structures seem to have intelligent-like patterns to them. So, hey, if this is a simulation, it maybe the starting parameters for the simulation have consciousness easy. I don't know. But if something happens there, it would change the game, right? And I would expect another wave of fear. I would expect another wave of concern and, frankly, more disruption. And it seems like disruptors are coming more quickly. So the most likely thing is that plateau of productivity, boredom, and we adjust and adapt what we're doing. We start to find AI in every part of the business. We start to get used to it. I think we'll probably still be in a hybrid workforce, most of which is about real estate prices, by the way, just putting it out there. But it's those two things. Will we have a general revolution against it, or will we break through the true sentience barriers? And those are the things that could change the game. That's my high-level crystal ball Sam
deceleration or a significant acceleration.
Exactly.
Super interesting. I guess we'll wait and see.
Otherwise, it's going to be boring.
We'll try to keep the doors open and the security locks still functioning. Sam, this has been great. Thanks a lot for joining us and sharing all these views.
I appreciate it. Thank you.
And thanks everybody for tuning in. And I hope you join us for the next one.
Thank you for listening to The Secure Developer. You will find other episodes and full transcripts on devseccon.com. We hope you enjoyed the episode, and don't forget to leave us a review on Apple iTunes or Spotify, and share the episode with others who may enjoy it and gain value from it. If you would like to recommend a guest or topic or share some feedback, you can find us on Twitter at DevSecCon and LinkedIn at The Secure Developer. See you in the next episode.